Provincetown is a small town in New England County located in Massachusetts in the United States. It's a small, coastal town with an estimated population of 3,664 as of the census of 2020. The location is famous for the Race Point Dunes on Cape Cod, where families take their children to cool off in the waters during the summer heat. But in 1974, Provincetown would be marked not only by its beauty, but also by a crime that would take nearly 50 years to be solved. On the morning of July 26, 1974, 12-year-old Leslie Metcalfe and her 13-year-old sister Sandra Lee were hiking in the dunes of Race Point with their family when at one point they smelled a very strange smell. After the two sisters looked at each other and talked about that smell, their dog ran off, only stopping next to something that the girls thought was a lifeless deer. However, as soon as they approached to pick up the dog, they saw that it was not actually a deer, but the body of a woman in an advanced state of decomposition. The two sisters screamed and ran towards their parents to tell what they found. Immediately, the local police were called and the area where the body was cordoned off for analysis. The body was completely naked and was on top of a green beach towel. She was face down and the left side of her head was disfigured from the injuries that were inflicted. Her head was covered by a blue bandana and was supported by a pair of jeans. Some of her teeth had been knocked out as well as both of her hands. There was a pair of footprints that led to where the body was found, and there was also a tire track that went 5 meters to the road. The body was covered by insects and in advanced state of decomposition due to the hot and humid climate of the place. Due to the circumstances, experts determined that the woman had died within 10 days to 3 weeks. After the autopsy, it was determined that the cause of death was due to multiple blunt trauma to the head region caused by a shovel. It was also determined that the aggressor introduced a piece of wood into the victim through her private parts, and he would have done this post-mortem when she was no longer alive. In addition, the woman had bruises on her neck, which indicated that the attacker had attempted to suffocate her. According to the coroners, the victim was a white woman with athletic build and estimated age between 25 and 35 years old. As much as some of her teeth were missing, it was possible to conclude that she treated them at very expensive dentists, since she had several gold crowns. However, as she didn't have a complete set of teeth or fingerprints, as her hands were cut off, the police were unable to identify her. For the police, there was no doubt that the criminal took the trouble to get rid of the victim's teeth and hands so that she would not be identified, thus making the investigations difficult. Due to the police not being able to identify the woman, she came to be called the Lady of the Dunes, due to the place where she was found. As there were no signs of struggle at the location where the body was found, police theorized that she must have known her assailant or been attacked while she was sleeping at the scene. This matched the fact that there were a couple of footprints leading to it, and also the tire track. Later, in an attempt to identify her, the police released the woman's physical description to the public. According to them, she was 1.68 meters tall, weighed 66 kilograms, athletic body, had reddish blonde hair, and her nails were painted pink, and that perhaps could help with the identification. Detectives checked all the portraits of missing persons in the area and also tried to identify the vehicle that left the tire tracks near the crime scene, but they found nothing. Without an identification and without any clues, the body was buried on October 19, 1974, with a headstone that read, "Body of unmarked woman found in Race Point Dune on July 26, 1974. The victim's first facial reconstruction was done with clay in 1979 by Clyde Snow, a forensic artist. Her body was exhumed in 1980 for further expertise and to try to find new clues, but nothing new has emerged. In 1987, a young woman allegedly confessed to a friend that she had seen her father take the life of a woman in Massachusetts about 15 years before. Her friend would have communicated the police about it, and although they initially didn't take the story very seriously, they went after the young woman to verify if what she said was real. Strangely, This young woman was never located. She simply disappeared and the police couldn't find her anywhere. Because of this, the authorities were unable to prove whether the story was real and whether it had any connection with the case of the Lady of the Dunes. Still, in 1987, another young woman told the police that the facial reconstruction of the victim made by forensic artist Clyde Snow was very similar to her sister, who had disappeared in Boston in 1974. Her sister's name was Rory Jean Kassinger, who would have been 25 years old at the time of the crime. According to Rory's records, she had escaped from a Boston prison in 1973 and has not been seen since. Detectives compared photos of Rory that were provided by her sister with the victim's facial reconstruction performed in 1979, and indeed, they noticed some similarities. With the advancement of technology, in the 2000s, the woman's body was again exhumed to collect a DNA sample, but when it went through the system, it was not compatible with any other DNA that was there. Around the same time, police collected DNA from Rory Jean Kassinger's sister to compare it with the victim's DNA. Due to the close resemblance between Rory and the victim's facial reconstruction, many police officers working on the case were convinced that the DNA test would give a positive link. However, after the tests were ready, it was found that Rory was not the Lady of the Dunes and didn't have any blood connection. This was a serious blow for the authorities, as many believed that the case would finally come to an end. In May 2010, police used a scanner to create an accurate image of the victim when she was alive using her skull. This image was widely circulated in hopes of recognition, but unfortunately, no one came forward. In August 2015, Joe Hill, son of the famous author Stephen King, speculated that the Lady of the Dunes could have been one of the extras in the movie Jaws, released in the year 1975. The movie was filmed in 1974 on Martha's Vineyard, just a 2-hour drive from Provincetown. According to Joe Hill, at minute 54 and 2 seconds of the film, it is possible to see a woman very similar to the Lady of the Dunes, who was even wearing jeans and a blue bandana, just like those found at the crime scene. The police contacted the film's production to find out more about this extra. However, the production reported that they had no records of any of the actors who acted in the film at the time. As absurd as this theory that the victim was an extra from the movie Jaws from '75 might seem, the detective decided to do an investigation about it, since after so many years any clue was valuable. However, they were unable to obtain the information they wanted to proceed, and with that, this theory had to be set aside. Later, a new theory emerged, this time created by Sandra Lee, one of the girls who found the body on the morning of July 26, 1974. Sandra had become obsessed with the case and decided to start her own investigation, coming to the conclusion that the person responsible for the crime was a man named James Whitey Bolger. James was one of the Irish mob bosses who had the mark of extracting his victim's teeth. In addition, some people claimed to have seen him together with a woman who looked very similar to the victim. The police even investigated James to see if he actually had any connection with the crime, but they couldn't find anything concrete, and thus, James, who was already arrested for other crimes, was left aside. The fact that Sandra found the body when she was little marked her life so much that in addition to being obsessed with the case, she also ended up becoming a writer of criminal books. Subsequently, a new theory emerged, and in this one, suspicion fell on a man named Tony Costa. Tony was a serial criminal who operated in the same area where the body was located, and besides, his other crimes had a certain resemblance of what happened to the Lady of the Dunes. However, after a brief investigation, authorities discovered that Tony had died on May 12, 1974, about 2 months before the Lady of the Dunes crime. Years later, Haddon Clark, another serial criminal who was active in the 70s and 90s, confessed to the police that he was responsible for the crime of the Lady of the Dunes, but that he would never reveal her identity as the police had treated him very badly. Haddon even indicated a place in his home where there were several belongings of women who were his victims, which he kept as trophies. Police officers asked for more information about the crime, to be sure he was really responsible. However, the man only told things that had appeared in the newspaper's articles and that anyone could have access to. Details that only the police and the person responsible for the crime would know, he never did. In addition, Haddon was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, making his statements about this case, which were already vague, completely lose credibility. Thus, as there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime, he was ruled out as a suspect. In early 2022, the remains of the Lady of the Dunes were sent to a company called Unheard-of, which specializes in forensic genealogy and has helped solve several crimes, disappearances, and also identify indigents. From this, a DNA profile was generated which was used to identify the victim's ancestors and eventually used this to identify her. Months later, on October 31, 2022, the FBI office in Boston announced that after almost 50 years, the Lady of the Dunes was finally identified. It was Ruth Marie Terry. Ruth was born on September 8, 1936 in the state of Tennessee, but has also lived in the states of Michigan, Massachusetts, and California. At the time of the crime, Ruth was married and 37 years old. Now, with the victim's identity in hand, the authorities would investigate to find out who was responsible for the crime. Initially, the officers went after Ruth's ex-husband, to whom she was married at the time of the crime. The man, whose name was Guy Rockwell Modovan, had died in March 2002 at the age of 78. However, when the police dug up some information about him, they discovered some very suspicious and disturbing things. To begin with, despite being married, Ruth and Guy had identities with different names, and this, according to the police, would help keep the authorities away from Guy if the victim had been identified in the first months of investigation, still in 74. According to the police, they had gotten married in the state of Nevada a few months before Ruth was the victim of the crime. Furthermore, Guy was suspected of various crimes since the 1950s. He was first investigated for taking the life of a 28-year-old man named Harry Baird and the disappearance of that same man's girlfriend, a 17-year-old named Barbara Jo Kelly. The crimes would have occurred in 1950 in the state of California, but despite being considered the main suspect, the police were unable to link him to the cases. Later, in 1960, he also became the prime suspect in having taken the life of his then wife, Manzanita Mearns, and also her daughter, Dolores Mearns. The bodies of both were found divided into parts inside a well on the property where Guy lived with them in the city of Seattle in the state of Washington. Guy was arrested at the time in New York City after having fled Seattle after the police requested his presence to give testimony. However, he was not arrested for long because, as in the previous case in California, the police were also unable to link him to the crime. Still in 1960, Guy remarried to a woman named Evelyn Emerson, and the following year, 1961, he was arrested again on charges of having cheated and stolen $10,000 from his current wife's family. Guy was sentenced to 15 years in prison for this. However, in March 1962, a judge said he would suspend his sentence as long as he promised to return all the money he stole. Guy then returned the money to his wife's family and was released from prison. Years later, he divorced Evelyn and later met Ruth, marrying her in Nevada in February 1974. During his life, Guy lived in several states and used several pseudonyms, a very suspicious attitude. Besides all that, Guy even wrote a bizarre book entitled Cookie with Rump Oil. In that book, according to the authorities, there are passages and images drawn by Guy himself that are considered a little disturbing. To the officers working the case, Guy Rockwell Modovan was likely a serial offender, and there is a large percentage of him being responsible for the crimes he was accused of, as well as the crime against Ruth Marie Terry. The police also didn't rule out the possibility that he was the author of more crimes that the authorities are still unaware of. It was expected in the following months that the police would request a court order to exhume Guy's body, and thus collect his DNA to put in the database and see if they can find any links. If indeed Guy was a serial offender, this procedure will certainly help to confirm this. According to Ruth's family, when she disappeared in 74, Guy told them that his wife had sold all her belongings and moved out of state. Guy would have also said that he suspected that Ruth had joined some religious cult and that she probably would not return home. Even hearing this from Guy, Ruth's family never stopped looking for her. They traveled across several states where they visited numerous cities, showing Ruth's picture to local residents in hopes of getting some information about her. They also put up thousands of posters wherever they went and even hired a private detective to help them with the searches. Altogether, there were almost 50 years of doubts and anguish. Now, with the confirmation that the Lady of the Dunes is Ruth Marie Terry, the family can give her a proper burial and have some comfort. Flowers, shells, stones, and a temporary plaque bearing Ruth Marie Terry's name now adorn her grave in St. Peter's Cemetery, which was previously simply marked as an identified female for 48 years. Alright folks, that's it for today. Thanks for watching until the end, best wishes, and I see you next time.